working backwards in the logic.
Well, you see a little bit too of this, if I'm following you correctly, certainly in the time of Aquinas and then a little bit after Aquinas, this was a very Eurocentric, it always has been a very Eurocentric doctrine, at least it was for a number of years. And then you get these post-Aquinas philosophers who are having to deal with the expansion of Europeans into the New World. And how do you deal, what about just war when you're dealing with, you know, the Peruvian Indians, okay? How do the just war parameters still apply? And some of the thinkers that you'll see, and I really would encourage you, if you're interested in this topic, to study some of these people that I mentioned, because some of these issues of, you know, what if you're dealing with a different race? What if you're dealing with a different culture, a different nationality that doesn't know anything about just war and doesn't care anything about it?
What if you're dealing with a war that hasn't been framed in terms of Christians versus non-Christians? And you don't have that benevolent monarch making these decisions.
Right, which is certainly where we are today. I mean, I would hope that we're not framing it, you know, as
no, we aren't. It seems like some of the discussion is to be really clear on what's a just war. It almost seems like, well, you better decide first what the framework is. And, and if it's not Christian versus non-Christian, then it's up to the...
You're having two different conversations in two different languages, and people are going like this with the whole thing. Is the whole situation. When you take something that's pre-Renaissance versus post-Renaissance, in my opinion, the Renaissance was the opportunity for man to justify himself in his own needs and find ways to allow him to feel good about it. Where the Augustinian view would be more to say, this is reality, deal with it.
Right.
Fit yourself to it.
Right, right. Which is, yeah, that's interesting. A little bit, I'm not saying that Augustine's Machiavellian, but that's a little bit too Machiavellian.
No, I think he's just an extreme realist.
Right, in the sense where you say this is the way it is, and this is just where we are. Which I think Aquinas would say the same thing, except that he would say it's not as bad as you may think it is. We can work it out. We can do this. We're human beings fundamentally, and human beings have an ability to form a government and have an ability to get along because it's a part of who we are and it's a part of what we desire. You know, even though wars happen, you know, war is not, and I think Machiavelli would probably say, and I think he does, war is the natural state of man. Aquinas would say, no, not necessarily at all. Susan?
Well, I was just thinking, I was trying to figure out how this works in, because it definitely needs to work in. And that is, we take the Peruvians, for example, the Andean natives and liberation theology. And how does that sound? I mean, there we have, you know, the liberation theology is actually touting war.
Yeah.
It's actually what?
Touting war.
Touting war.
It's promoting it.
Right.
It's, you know, so, and I was wondering how that fit in with the whole, well, if priests are not to be soldiers, if priests are not to be soldiers, pure priests and bishops, what does that make them? I mean, can they justify being fomenters?
Can they justify being
fomenters?
Ooh, that's like you just condemned about 4 or 5 popes and started the Crusades there.
Well, yeah.
Well,
these are naming any names.
These are good questions, and they're things to think about. And I do not know the answer, but this is a very this is one of the things that certainly just war raises a lot of questions like this, because again the issue is sometimes the other side is not necessarily playing by the same rules, and then what do you do? You know. Then what do you do?
I think more than not playing by the same rules, they're not playing by the same logical construct.
Right.
Right.
You have a circumstance, I think, where people know where they want to go, then they construct rules that allow them to get there.
Right.
Where Augustine starts with a point and says, this is logic that starts at point A, and this is where you get to the end.
Right. Right. That's a good point.
There's no little box that says, then a miracle happens and you come out the other side.
Yeah, yeah, and you know, when you talk, and this is one of the things about talking about just war, and Aquinas talked about this too. It's not a science. It's not a science. It's not a plug and play. It's not like you can. It's not a checklist. It is an art, and it is a very. It can be very slippery. It can be, you know, because when do you have a just cause? So, and that's
Who
why.
defines just?
Right. You can start talking about what does this mean? And there are definitions, and you know that because you've got a sheet with definitions that I didn't make up, but they're pretty much considered by most modern just war theorists to be more or less correct. But that doesn't mean that it's an easy decision. And that doesn't mean that you can look at any particular, I don't think, that you can look at any particular war and say, well, look, it doesn't meet the criteria, it's unjust. Or, well, look, easy, it's just. These are hard decisions. Okay, I want to move on a little bit with Aquinas. We have a little bit of time left because there's a couple of things I think are pretty interesting to hit. We talked about double effect at the end of last week, and this is under the prong of right intention. Does anybody remember the three things that Aquinas flat out stated make up a just war, or make for a just war?
Just cause.
Just cause.
Right intention.
Right intent.
Competent authority.
Competent authority, right. And I'm jumping to his right intent because I think it's very interesting what he says about this doctrine of double effect. Does anybody remember what we talked about with double effect last week?
Isn't that the same as collateral damage? Or no?
Well, no, they're definitely related. Double effect is sort of how you make the decision when you know that, or when you suspect perhaps that there may be innocent bystanders killed.
So one is your intent, and the other is a necessary conclusion, or a necessary part of that intent, which is not intentional.
Right. It's this idea that an action can have two consequences, one of which is intended and one of which is unintended. And this is where I think is interesting what Aquinas says. He doesn't say necessarily that you do a balancing, and you'll notice on the just war sheet it's sort of a balancing test. Because remember, with just war today, we don't talk about the heart. You know, even measuring right intent, you can't talk about the heart, you can't measure it, especially when you're dealing with a sort of a secular just war theory. But for Aquinas, you can measure the heart, and in fact it is the intent of the heart that determines whether or not an action is just. When you know an action has two effects, it's whatever you intend in your heart. If it's to destroy the other nation's enemies, this is a good intent, assuming you're in a just war. If it is to destroy or to kill or to injure innocent bystanders, if that is your intent, you got a problem. All right, now this raises some interesting questions that are very controversial. All right.
Don't we love those?
Yes, we do. Now, Aquinas said if the sovereign's goal is to end the war by killing soldiers, you have a just intent. If the goal is to cause suffering to the civilian population, that's a no-go. All right. Can anybody think of some examples in the past?
Perhaps the firebombing of Japan.
Right. So how about the carpet bombing in Europe? Dresden. Right. They just rebuilt that cathedral 2 years ago. We were there when they finished it. What was the intent of bombing Dresden? Does anybody know?
To demoralize and drive them to general populations, pressuring the government to capitulate.
Right.
Which, when you've got Hitler as the government head,
There really weren't any military objectives.
No.
What about
The
Sherman's?
same thing with the firebomb bombing of Tokyo. There really wasn't any military thing in there. It was more a try to drive the population to a level of despair that would cause them to capitulate.
Was it Dresden also somewhat retaliatory for, what was it, Coventry?
yeah.
Yeah.
There was,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what about Sherman's March to the Sea?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
This whole idea, and he made it very clear, we're bringing the war to the people.
Or the Roman legions going through insulting the fields.
The slaughter at Shiloh, that he thought he could do something to end that kind of pitched battle in which thousands died.
Yeah,
Right.
I think
Right.
the Sherman is,
What-
you will really want to avoid that for this class.
I understand.
Yeah, because there's so many different.
Well, but that's why I don't want to avoid it. See, because there's so many ways to look at it. It's not. I don't think it's an easy answer, but this is exactly, and it's the same as the argument with Hiroshima. And it's not the exact same, but it's this
I
idea
think
that.
Hiroshima might have been necessary, but maybe
Well,
not Nagasaki.
and I understand there will be a number of different opinions in here, and this is why I think this is a very interesting thing to think about, because it's a little bit of a dilemma.